An ongoing battle in the world of birds is the fight against extinction. Over 150 bird species around the world have already lost this fight, with many more declining to the point where there is serious concern over their longevity. Fortunately, not all critically endangered species end up going extinct, and with the help of conservation efforts, actually make a recovery. One such species is the whooping crane. The whooping crane is an impressive bird, standing around 5 feet tall and boasting a wingspan of more than 7 feet. This crane is actually the tallest bird species in North America. Other than their immense size, these cranes can be identified by their pure white coloration covering most of their body, their black wingtips, and their red facial markings. Whooping cranes were very close to going extinct, but are now starting to trend in the opposite direction. Here's the story of how this majestic bird came back from the brink. Let's flash back to the early 1600s. This is pre-European settlement, and whooping cranes are thriving. In the late 1700s, however, things began to change. Early settlers discovered a land with many natural resources, including animals, and began capitalizing on the many species they could hunt. At the time, nobody was giving any thought to what species may be low in numbers, or if there was even a need to preserve them. While hunting pressure was certainly not helpful to the species, things would only get worse when the Homestead Act passed in the 1860s. This act encouraged people to move west, where they altered much of the habitat that whooping cranes inhabited by making farms and cattle pastures. This combination of hunting and habitat loss caused whooping crane numbers to plummet, taking what was a population that once numbered in the tens of thousands to under 2,000 by the late 1890s. In the early 1900s, people started to realize many bird species were in trouble. This led to one of the first pieces of legislation aimed at mitigating the negative effects humans have had on migratory birds, the 1913 Weeks-McLean Act, making it illegal to hunt migratory birds in spring, selling living or dead migratory birds, or using bird feathers in women's fashion. Eventually, more assistance for the whooping crane and migratory birds arrived in the form of the 1918 Migratory Birds Treaty Act. This legislation made it illegal to hunt, sell, kill, or capture any migratory birds in the United States, including the sandhill and whooping crane. At this point, there were roughly 1,000 whooping cranes left in the world. While people were beginning to understand the necessity to help out endangered bird species, whooping crane numbers continued to drop through the early 1900s. During this time, one of the most important areas for these large birds was the Aransas National Wildlife Refuge in Texas. This refuge served as the wintering grounds for the last large flock of whooping cranes in the world. The area was purchased in 1937, and a year later, counts of whooping cranes began. The first manager of the refuge was named James Stevenson, and one of his responsibilities was tallying the amount of whooping cranes at the refuge each year. Without any roads, he trudged through the marshes and salt flats, searching for these important cranes. During the 1938 count, Stevenson only found 18 whooping cranes, a far cry from the nearly 1,000 that were estimated to be there a century earlier. It's hard to know the exact number of wild cranes at this point due to the difficulty of the terrain and the nature of bird counts in general, but either way, the situation was dire. To make matters worse, a devastating natural disaster further ravaged the global whooping crane population. A hurricane hit the coast of Louisiana, home to a flock of 13 cranes. With the weather pushing the cranes out of their habitat, and much of their territory being underwater or damaged by the storm, only 6 of the birds returned. It's unclear what happened to the other 7, but biologists assume they passed away. In the early 1940s, the global population of whooping cranes hit an all-time low of 21, with 18 in Texas and 3 in Louisiana's Gulf Coast. Historical records differ on exactly which year in the 40s marked this low point, but one thing that's for certain is that whooping cranes were actually extremely close to being lost forever. One massive problem stood in the way of potential human intervention in the fight to save the whooping crane. This was the fact that nobody knew where their breeding grounds were. This changed when a wildfire broke out in Canada in June of 1854. Helicopter pilots named Dan Lindells and George Wilson spotted 2 large birds flying near a marsh in Wood Buffalo National Park in Alberta. They turned out to be whooping cranes, and a discovery was made that would alter the course of the species forever. With scientists and conservationists now knowing the location where the whooping cranes were breeding, the they began developing a plan to save the species. Firstly, whooping crane eggs were taken from the wild birds and brought into captivity to be raised. While this seems counterintuitive, whooping crane nests with multiple eggs typically weren't very successful, and the subsequent birds to hatch after the first usually didn't survive. Sometimes, fertile eggs were placed in whooping crane nests that didn't have fertile eggs to distribute the chicks, helping wild populations to strengthen their numbers. Between 1967 and 1996, more than 400 eggs were collected, with roughly half of them being reintroduced to the wild. For captive rearing, eggs were brought to the Patuxent Wildlife Research Center in Maryland, where a captive flock was created. Though the problem of how to get fertile whooping crane eggs was solved, a new problem arose. Eggs hatched in captivity imprinted on people and couldn't be released into the wild. Interestingly enough, the cranes didn't actually realize they were cranes and essentially thought they were humans. Therefore, they wouldn't even look for other whooping cranes as mates. This problem would later be solved, but we'll get to that a bit later. As things were starting to look up for the whooping cranes, more help would come from the federal government. In this case, an unlikely hero emerged from the Oval Office, Richard Nixon. Yes, that's right, that Richard Nixon helped pass the Endangered Species Act in 1973, which gave protection to species listed as threatened or endangered, making it illegal to harm or take them from the wild. It also helped to protect the habitats that these endangered species call home, and has been a major success for not just the whooping crane, but also the bald eagle, as well as many other animals too. It also punished people that broke the law in regards to endangered animals, levying serious fines and even jail time to offenders. Remember that issue with young cranes imprinting on humans? In 1985, a wildlife biologist named Dr. Rob Horwich concocted an idea to solve it: puppets. People dressed in all white, black on the tips of their hands, and using a whooping crane head puppet to feed the young cranes began the process of raising chicks. The use of puppets in costumes was a massive step forward in unlocking the keys to success for saving the whooping crane. But eventually, scientists realized that having the entire captive whooping crane population in one place was a precarious situation. If disease hit the center in Maryland, it's possible that the entire population could be decimated. As a result, it was decided to move part of the flock to the International Crane Foundation in Wisconsin. The birds got to their new home in 1989, and by 1991 started producing eggs. Around this time, over 150 whooping cranes were in the wild, with around 50 in captivity, a significant improvement compared to their all-time low in the 1940s. Things continued to look up in 1993, when the first puppet-reared cranes were released in Kissimmee Prairie in Florida. The first chick born wild in the USA since the 1930s hatched in 2002. Sadly, the Kissimmee Prairie proved to be a difficult place for these cranes to survive in, and eventually it was decided not to release additional birds in this area. In 1999, another problem was solved with a creative solution. How in the world could humans teach captive-bred whooping cranes to migrate? Based on an experiment that used an airplane to teach baby geese to migrate, co-founder of the International Crane Foundation, George Archibald, hypothesized that the same method could be used for cranes. In 2000, an ultralight aircraft took off from Wisconsin with whooping cranes trailing behind it. It was the first group of cranes to migrate in the eastern United States in over 100 years. To make this trip a reality, the cranes needed to imprint on both the plane and the pilot, who was still costumed like a whooping crane while flying. Calls were blasted from the plane, encouraging the whooping cranes to follow. Before the flight, work was already being done with practice flights to prepare each crane fitted with bands and a transmitter for the long flight. Currently, the global whooping crane population looks something like this. The same original flock that persisted when these birds were on the brink of extinction still migrates from Canada to Texas. Another self-sustaining population also migrates from Wisconsin to Florida and back each year. This was the population originally taught to migrate from the ultralight aircrafts. There are also non-migratory populations in Louisiana and Florida, with the Louisiana population first being reintroduced in 2011. Due to all the conservation efforts, the global whooping crane population, which once numbered in the 20s, now is at an estimated 826 birds, with about 600 of them in the wild, a massive improvement. It's worth noting that many of the fascinating efforts used to raise chicks are outdated now, such as costume and puppet rearing, which was stopped in 2016, as well as the ultralight aircraft flights. Instead, the adult captive cranes raise the chicks until they fledge. They are then released near wild whooping cranes. While the future is certainly a lot brighter now for the whooping crane than it was decades ago, there are still some challenges that they face. One of these is hunting. Over the years, a number of cranes in the Louisiana population were shot and killed. With sandhill crane hunting becoming a hot topic, it's conceivable that whooping cranes could be collateral damage from hunters, even with the major punishments that come along with killing one of them. While the whooping crane is still listed as an endangered species, it serves as one of the biggest success stories in the history of species rehabilitation. With the help of many different organizations, whooping cranes may one day be off of the endangered species list, and hopefully never again reach the critical population levels they once had. Only time will tell, but at least for now, whooping cranes have successfully come back from the brink. Would you like to know about other species that defeated extinction? Let us know in the comments below. And as always, thanks for watching. We'll see you next time on Badgerland Birding.